Awesome. How you doing, Michael?
Hey, Brandon. It's good to see you, brother.
You too. Excited for this. We get to talk about asset tokenization 2.0 today with one of the foremost experts in tokenization, Michael, CEO of 10XDS. Michael, how long have you been, working in and out of the tokenization scene?
So we founded 10XTS as a real-world asset tokenization company in 2017, and so we had been experimenting with things a couple years prior, but it's been quite a while.
Awesome. And you guys, if I am correct, you guys are not just technology, but you've heavily focused on regulatory compliance side of the entire process, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, wonderful. So tell me what we're going to get to talk about today. Excited.
Well, asset tokenization 2.0, of course, we just introed, and then here's a quick little introduction slide for the session today. And we're going to talk about a brief introduction to asset tokenization for those that may not be aware that are just attending the session just out of curiosity and maybe don't have a whole lot of exposure, then problems with the existing asset tokenization models that exist today. And then we're going to get into asset tokenization 2.0. We want to get through the slides and get to some good Q&A and discussion. So we're going to move pretty quickly today. So as Brandon said, I'm Michael Hiles, founder, CEO of a company called 10XTS, and then 10XTS is now working to merge and become a founding member of the Conduit network, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So what is asset tokenization 2.0? Or 1.0? So asset tokenization started out as an experiment to try to launch tokens as digital twins of a real world asset on a layer one blockchain. And so people are creating tokens and emitting tokens on Ethereum or Polygon or Avalanche, other layer one blockchains that as it exists. And this came about as a result early on of the crypto asset market explosion of just digital assets by themselves. People observed
Hey,
a lot.
Michael.
Yeah.
Sorry, it looks like we may not be streaming on LinkedIn. Let's just press pause just for a hot second. I want to make sure we get that audience. Sorry to interrupt you. You were in your jam, but I want to make sure we're live on LinkedIn. Okay, we've got confirmation. Got confirmation from some that it is. Okay, so just want to make sure. Looks like it is. Can we confirm that it's been live the whole time, or do we need to repeat anything? Yep. Okay. Live. Great. Thank you. We had some reports that it wasn't, but it looks like it is. Sorry, Michael. Go for it. We're good.
We're good. We don't have to redo. Awesome. So asset tokenization originally came about as the advent of crypto and blockchain started. People started looking at the possibilities with the technology of tokens and how tokens were behaving in markets. And arguably for the first time in history, Bitcoin was the first financial instrument that could list and trade simultaneously on multiple exchanges on a 24/7 basis globally. And that was an interesting thesis because that brought a lot of market making, and opportunists who came in and saw the opportunity to just simply create liquidity and arbitrage the markets, buy on one exchange, sell on another. And then folks were watching this, including myself, thinking, hey, what if you applied the underlying technology to existing assets? What does that need to look like?
Yeah.
And so there's been a lot of experimental projects that have happened. And of course, starting probably mid last year, the asset tokenization conversation started to surface as a mainstream discussion when you have folks like Larry Fink from BlackRock sitting on stage talking about the future's asset tokenization. All markets will be tokenized, and so that really has accelerated. So it's a great thesis that showed a significant amount of promise. Now, all of that being said, the idea is the benefits of tokenization. What are they? Fractional ownership of assets. We can create fungible tokens that represent an ownership interest in office buildings, gold, commodities, artwork, equity shares in companies. And it really was also driving the similar thesis of the The idea of cryptocurrency being some democratization of capital. By fractionalizing illiquid and expensive assets, it allows for smaller participation. What are some of those kinds of things? And then also by looking at the market itself from a crypto standpoint, market access and portability for otherwise relatively illiquid asset classes is also a key component to the idea of tokenization. Of course, liquidity. We have illiquid assets that trade over the counter and through existing marketplaces. Illiquidity discounts can be pretty significant depending on the asset class. And so bringing true price discovery and providing a strong liquidity mechanism was very appealing. And then, of course, because it's tech, administrative process automation. This, of course, is asset class dependent, market dependent, but the idea is once you're starting to designate things as digital instruments, how can we then further advance the state of automation, especially for cumbersome and manual process laden activities like secondary market clearing, settling, those kinds of things that while, we have decent markets today and we're moving from, T+2 to T+1 settlement in the equity markets, it's still not atomic settlement like a crypto asset would be.
Yep.
Now we have some problems with asset tokenization 1.0.
I see a lot of lacks here.
There's a bunch of lacks. First and foremost is a lot of approaches have lacked conformity with existing regulations in the law. Just because the tech can do something doesn't mean that you should do something with it. Mm-hmm. And so that's been a tough lesson for a lot of people to discover and figure out. The technology folks are discovering law and finance and some of these things. And then the other side of the equation, you've got folks that are in the markets, the financial folks, the legal folks that are looking at it saying, well, wait a second, in our world, that doesn't work. There's also a lack of standards, a remarkable lack of standards for data and network operation itself. And that gets all the way down to how smart contracts to launch tokens are coded, existing Oracle solutions that inject off-chain data into a smart contract to make things more intuitive and provable. Those Oracles lack standards. There's also a lack of enterprise-grade cybersecurity. Hard stop on that. Most non-Bitcoin blockchain networks are validated in centralized cloud solutions and or other mechanisms for hosting validation that just simply lack enterprise-grade cybersecurity controls. There's also a significant lack of interoperability and portability between institutional silos. And what I mean by this is there are some initial folks that have gotten into the tokenization space as licensed and registered brokers, exchanges, et cetera. But the problem is that their data and the way that they architect their data and their management is designed to not necessarily be interoperability with other exchanges. And so I call this Wall Street 1.5 because it's really still a Wall Street 1.0 mentality. We want to silo and capture the entirety of the transactional stack so that we're your retail window, we're your liquidity provider, we're your transfer agent, we're your custodian, and they want to silo these things out. And if that's the case, why even have a token? It's a big question that I have.
Good question.
It's an amazing question, right? And then there's also, because of the lack of interoperability and portability, there's challenges with advancing the discussion from a regulatory alignment and an acceptance standpoint. Because the only way the regulators think today is in terms of particularly equity markets. We've got centralized securities depository, right? We've got DTCC that does all the back end. Again, a monolithic centralized organization that at this point is a looming specter of too big to fail. Yeah. Then, of course, lack of qualified custody. We don't have custodians that can handle things like tokenized securities. 15C3-3 custody largely does not exist. And without getting into the politics of choke point 2.0, some of these other conversations, we just simply don't have the ability to settle and clear through custodians from a broker standpoint, from a market standpoint. right? It doesn't exist.
Yep.
It absolutely does not exist today. And then ultimately, there's a lack of integration with legacy financial enterprise systems and market infrastructure. They're just not set up to handle the ability to interact with the data of tokenized assets. Now, I touched on previously, and Brandon, this is near and dear to our hearts here with Asset Tokenization 2.0. We have a very significant issue with centralized cloud data centers. Mm-hmm. Because that's where existing layer one blockchains are ultimately residing right now. People spin up an instance on a EC3 server at AWS, and I kind of chuckle when people tell me how the blockchain's decentralized. And it's like, well, it might be at the validator level, but it's certainly not decentralized at the infrastructure level because you're consolidating all of the bare metal inside of a small handful of companies that ultimately run the blockchain underneath the hood. This is a big problem.
And we wonder why they're willing to send out grants and money and everything else for the Web3 ecosystem, because they would like us to continue to run on top of them.
Well, that's kind of it. Again, it's back to the incentives from the financial industry side of why tokenize, right? We want to capture all the transactional stack. You still have the perverse lack of alignment incentives from even the tech stack side. Then, of course, you've got cybersecurity issues. Everyone remembers CrowdStrike and some of these other issues because these are honeypots for vectors of attack. Yep. Everyone's trying to get into AWS. Everyone's trying to get into Azure. And then, big one for me personally is everything you send to their computers is subject to their purview. Yep. And so data privacy and sovereignty of data is a really big challenge right now. And that ultimately has led to what we see today with big tech power concentration and control over everyone's data, everyone's financial data, everyone's personal identity. These are all issues that are hot topics of discussion. So what's the solution for some of these things? We decided to call it Asset Tokenization 2.0 because we really do think it's a generational leap to the next generation of, actual, the state of the art. Mm-hmm. So what is Asset Tokenization 2.0? Asset Tokenization 2.0 in our world is based upon a subset of blockchain called DePIN. It's Decentralized Physical Infrastructure Network. We'll get into that here in a minute. But in particular, Conduit Network is a consortium of multiple founding companies that have pooled their intellectual property to launch the network. And it integrates hardware, operating systems, and protocols to provide a very robust, secure, and scalable foundation for the next generation of asset management. That is our foundational layer. Mm-hmm. Now let's talk about DePIN. What is DePIN? It's been around. This is not necessarily a brand new concept. In fact, there's some very large legacy blockchain projects that a lot of folks would recognize. Helium is one, Filecoin, storage, and it's basically taking infrastructure to the network level where the network meters resource availability and consumption. Participants that bring resources to the network earn rewards for providing those resources. And then, of course, those rewards, tokens, can be sold in secondary markets to buyers for liquidity to pay for things like electricity and operating expenses, as well as profit. Then, of course, when people are wanting to leverage that infrastructure, they can go out and purchase tokens on markets to either stake or spend to buy network resources. So it does become sort of the casino chip or the Chuck E. Cheese token that activates the machine underneath the hood when you're wanting to use these decentralized types of networks. So I won't focus on this. This is a complicated slide, but DePIN relies on what we call the DePIN flywheel, and it's infrastructure that gets stronger as it gets bigger. Centralized infrastructure has a remarkable issue with the fact that the bigger it gets, the harder it is to manage. And again, we get back to too big to fail infrastructure consolidations, whereas DePIN has network effects. These network effects are basically based on user experience. People use the infrastructure, they have good experiences, it increases the network usage, which leads to better token rewards, higher token value, more token liquidity. It also increases the demand for that infrastructure. And then on the supply side, that growth attracts users and entrepreneurs to come in and build on top of the infrastructure, add to the infrastructure, those kinds of things. So it really does become an economic flywheel for this type of infrastructure.
Hey, Michael, can we go back to that?
Yeah.
Just double click on that slide.
Yeah, sure.
The other thing that we talk about a big time internally to Conduit is the notion of summation here on this is, turning cost centers into profit centers. And one of the things that DPINs can really do here, because you're not only providing infrastructure that must be consumed as long as it's viable as a product into the market, but the participants that are providing that are able to turn, again, what would traditionally be a cost center and just pure use into a profit center of monetization. And I think that's fascinating when we talk about monetizing infrastructure and having it owned from a decentralized process. And how do you get participants to get involved? It's really that crux of like something that was a cost that we needed. It was a means to an end to accomplish what we were doing. To now looking at it like, hey, now there's an ability to turn that into a profit and to monetize things by participating in this network. And what's fascinating to me is you had two Web 2 versions of this, which is Uber and Airbnb, where they were able to take latent assets and turn them into revenue generating or profit center assets. And that's really what I think DPIN has an opportunity to do in multiple subsectors of infrastructure is that same type of model. But again, removing the hierarchy of a corporation and placing it down to individuals and participants, which is it's a really, really cool business model that is, I think, very disruptive. And the last thing I would, bring all that to fruition and say that in doing that, you now have the opportunity for people to participate in an area in which they couldn't participate before, right? And the democratization of wealth. You don't need top codes to do this. You can do this by participation and spreading the wealth and then on an attack vector side, spreading the attack vectors out across the entire network. So it's all fascinating to me and super excited. But thank you. I just want to double click on that.
Yeah, and to your point, Brandon, that Conduit is not necessarily an asset tokenization network. We saw the opportunity to work with the founding team and come in to bring asset tokenization technology specifically into the network. But Conduit ostensibly is decentralization of cloud services. So it becomes an alternative to launching web applications, mobile applications, whatever. The alternative is I can spin up server instances in AWS or Azure, right, or Google Cloud or wherever. In this instance, this provides the baseline for someone who's using the network literally owns their portion of the network all the way down to the bare metal itself. They're actually able to not only operate hardware that works in conjunction with the network, but then to your point, Brandon, they're able, depending on what their business model is and what it looks like, they're able to transform their OpEx into a profit center based on capacity. I can host things and I'm going to use my own servers, but then when I'm not using at capacity, those servers, I'm selling that capacity back to the network. So that's a massive transformation of any IT implementation, not just tokenization. If you start to think about, hosting web applications or, other enterprise infrastructure, for the first time in history, it's possible to put together a thesis where your IT stack becomes a profit center inside of a corporation.
Yep.
So I don't want to go down that rabbit hole necessarily today, but that's a whole separate session we can talk about, and I'd love to. But that's really the foundations upon which asset tokenization 2.0 is built. And in fact, to the point that if somebody works with us to tokenize one of their real world assets, hardware is absolutely a component because we want them to own their entire stack. We want them to own their data that is managed on their own devices and not surrender control to any big centralized tech company, nor are they surrendering control over that data, which they do today, not only in tokenized asset 1.0 with financial institutions, but in traditional financial markets. They own all of your shareholder information. They own that, all of that data about your asset, that transactional data. It's siloed inside of that institution and that organization. We believe that everyone needs a master data management strategy that enables their sovereign ownership of their data independent of any specific institution, and that's what we're facilitating.
Yep.
So a big component to this is security. When we started to build Conduit Network, we went down to first principles and decided security first at the hardware level. And so we've got multiple form factors all the way down to a consumer device that's launching this year for in-home or small business use, but all the way up to very large scale rack infrastructure for full data centers, right? And so it's a self monetizing, plug and play, self organizing suite of modular components that are hardware, highly secured enclave that holds the security module operating system, some of the other technologies that we're going to get into here in a minute. But we're talking about Federal Information Processing Standard 140-2 Level 3 and NIST rated hardware. And this is literally the highest level of hardware based security that's possible in the civilian market. So this means we now have a hardware based key store enclave, which solves a lot of problems when you start to move digital assets across chains, through gateways, etc. It's usually the gateways where a lot of hacks happen.
Mm-hmm.
And so this solves for that problem, because now you're talking about a native hardware-based key store within the server device node itself. That this is just a small sample of the types of security architecture that when we set out to develop and build, and we've got an amazing team of very advanced security solutions folks that have come in as part of this founding group, that we're highly confident that at least it's better than the status quo of what's going on out there right now, and we're very excited about that.
And then can we double click there real quick too? Because the notion is if you have a vertically and horizontally scaling network and you're moving things out to the edge, which we do believe many things should be much more localized than at the edge. But what you trade off there is that you're no longer controlling the physical environment necessarily as much as you would in, let's say, a data center, right? Where they get to have high level of security that is even controlled at the physical location. And then into BIOS and into the actual servers, and like there's multi layers. So if you start to not have those paradigms, what that means, and where we had to start with, Michael, is that the actual devices themselves needed to be some of the most secure devices in the world, because we didn't control the environment in which they would be. Are they in an unlocked home, right? As an example, right? So if access was gained on the physical device itself, how do you ensure that safety and encryption is still happening there where penetration can't happen? And if you can solve for that, then what you ultimately get is a trusted network all the way out to the edge that you can start bringing capacity of high value, let's say enterprise, right, that have very high standards of the value in which they need to protect, and they can trust it, versus just a pure capacity play of saying, well, I've got general compute on my laptop, let me just provide it to the network. That's all fine, but that's the demand side, or excuse me, that's the supply side. The demand side sitting there going, well, wait, how do I trust that? How can I run any of my high value across this network of general compute that I have no idea where it is, who has it, what the physical device is, it's secured, anything. And I'm just supposed to trust that we don't believe that it'll happen. And so we had to start with, trusted environments, which is the physical hardware all the way at the edge and then back into it here, so that we could do one thing, move real value over to here. And we didn't believe we could have a strong conversation without that. So that was kind of why, speaking to a FIFS and NIST rated hardware, like, why does that matter? Why do you need that, right? Kind of your question of like, why do you need a token? Like, well, here's the reason. Because if you really want to have a distributed internet and infrastructure for it, you need to start with something that people can securely trust.
Yeah, that's correct. And what, a lot of the early, God love them, I love my, asset tokenization 1.0 colleagues and friends and family. But what they don't realize is, from an institutional standpoint, you have specific technology standards that have to be met in order for banks and regulated folks that are comprised of the existing market infrastructure that exists today. FFIEC standards, right? PCI compliance. You've got all of this checklist of standards that have to be met in order for that institution to actually touch the technology itself before you get to use case, right? And this really solves for that.
When you say, I love this, one of the things, sorry, this is just a great thing. You say, these are standards that need to be met. I love it. Yes. What's also interesting there is that I think we have an opportunity to not just meet them, but exceed them.
Yeah, totally agree.
Present new paradigms in which is proven exceeding of standards, and therefore by virtue of that creating new standards, right? But you're right, for peer adoption you at least have to meet the already quantified standards, or you're not even at the table. But if we can do that, the next step is like, how do we take that and go, that's great, but is there a way to increase the standards, which would increase, efficiencies, velocity, and everything, which is really what people, the claim to tokenization for me, and I'd love to hear your opinion, but for me, it's like the reason and the key that people are interested in is that if it's done right with these things, you have an opportunity to increase the speed of the velocity of capital.
That's totally correct.
If that can happen. Now but that's the goal up here, right? And why it would be valuable.
Yes.
But your point, I think of what you're saying all the way up to this point, Michael, is that if you don't accomplish all of these other lists, you're not going to get to that ultimate goal, which is increasing the velocity of capital.
Totally correct. I mean, markets, money loves speed. I mean, fundamental, right? Pre-tech, that's what's a fundamental. So now, how do we power this and facilitate this? So within the conduit network and the core and the bowels of the system that operates within these secured enclaves, not only is the operating system and the sequencers for the decentralization of the compute resources themselves, but there's also very specialized decentralized distributed ledger technology. There's very specialized ledgers that operate in conjunction with the operating system and other related tech. And by the way, we're only scratching the surface. There's no possible way to get into all of the components of the tech. Just in this session, I'm just going to highlight a couple of them so that people can understand why this is truly a generational leap in the state of the art for asset tokenization. So first and foremost, this ledger system, because it's not a blockchain, it's just a ledger, it creates a foundation for the metadata about the asset, about the details of that asset that becomes portable. It becomes interoperable, cross-chain, multi-chain, cross-institution, multi-institution. And then, I like to say you only need a token when you actually need a token, right? So this facilitates tokenization on demand, so that you can materialize a layer 1 token into a layer 1 blockchain when you actually want it or actually need it, as opposed to the current approach where it's, I've got a hammer and everything has to look like a nail. I've got a blockchain, I've got a token. How do we make this square peg fit into a round hole? So let's talk about these ledgers. First of all, we've got what's called a temporal ledger in temporal accounting. And it's literally a full accounting ledger. Brandon, are there any blockchain layer 1s out there that actually have a full accounting ledger at its core?
No, sir.
I didn't think so. So this is different.
Not that I'm aware of that can perform double entry account, like a true double entry accounting ledger. No.
Yeah, it doesn't exist. And so Conduit Network is the first core distributed ledger technology ecosystem to launch with a full double entry accounting system built into the core. And because of the temporal nature of the ledger, it allows us to do things like create future dated transactions. It's very important from a financial engineering and a financial accounting standpoint. It also creates a hugely immutable historical record, not only of the transaction itself, like a blockchain, token A, token went from wallet A to wallet B at this date and time, right? But you're talking about the full spectrum of all of the metadata that's associated with an asset that has been recorded on the Conduit ledger system. Probably the biggest component that really got me excited about the opportunities for Tokenization 2.0 is not only do we record assets on the ledger, but the ledger is actually a graph. It's a ledger of ledgers. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by this is when an asset is recorded on the Conduit ledger, it spawns a subordinate series of rights and obligations ledgers. It allows us to separate the rights to an asset away from the fundamental asset itself. We'll talk about that here a little bit more in a second. The other thing it enables is real-time asset management. So, you're talking about that velocity of capital, Brandon. It's really with the temporal ledger system that ties into the next concept. So what are applications of temporal ledgers, right? Automated fund allocations or dividend distributions, transparent reporting, predictive financial analysis, the implications of this in conjunction with AI, for example, AI agents. I've started speaking openly for the past several months about, everything will be tokenized, but the reason it will have to be tokenized is in the next few years, we're going to have a plethora of AI autonomous agents out there conducting commerce between themselves. Therefore, they're going to need digital representations in standardized fashion for agent to agent transactions.
Yep.
Because I don't think I'm going to give my AI agent access to my corporate checking account through Plaid. Probably not a good idea. Yeah, and other things like value chain management, right? You start to really unpack the possibilities here. It becomes, an interesting spectrum. Brandon, do you want to talk about synchronized accounting?
Yeah, sure. I mean, that was what Michael talked about as an accounting ledger. We've dubbed it synchronized accounting. As you can see here, it's a fully integrated process. So a lot of the blockchain right now is really at a settlement layer, right? It is an immutable ledger, but it's a settlement. It's transactional, and that's it. And the problem that we have here when we talk about reducing friction, if we bring this up to, the supply chains, value chains, and commerce level, is that the transaction layer, settlement layer is only one. But there's a whole lot of effort that needs to be done to take the transactions into, let's say, a traditional accounting and to do books and everything else, right? And that friction right now between the two worlds is very, very high. So high that it's a lot of people are looking at like, what is the actual advantage to doing my settlement over here when I still have this massive operational friction to get back into this other world, right? And so the integrated process and the ability to handle both worlds in the same paradigm, reducing massive amount of friction, increasing velocity, increasing trust, security, and immutability, which is all the things that we're looking at here, which, you're talking about cutting down on things like double entry errors and omissions, right? And things like that. So the benefits of synchronized accounting, you're massively reducing fraud and corruption. I think it's estimated, Michael, that you got 6.5% of global GDP that is lost to fraud. And as you double click into that annually, by the way, double click into it, there's a lot of that category that is like errors and omissions. It's not traditional fraud as we would think of it, but it kind of gets all lumped together in that bucket. And so how do we reduce that? Because that's an incredible loss leader out of global GDPs. You have enhanced transparency through the immutability in the ledger system. This is obviously, very similar. It is a full DLT, to be very clear. We don't call ourselves a blockchain, but we are a DLT technology. Automated compliance, Michael, I'd love for you to double click into that, but it's really based off of the upper two that we've talked about. You can now start to have, if you have the full record of the life cycle of the data, not just again at a transaction level, but into the accounting. When we're talking about compliance, Michael will get into this later on in compliance specific with asset tokenization, but I would even venture to like cast this out here of like things like, what if you could automate all of your taxes? Right?
Or just automated reporting into Edgar in real time.
There you go.
From an SEC standpoint, why do we have to wait for 8Ks and 10? I mean, it's just literally, and because of the nature of the synchronized accounting and the temporal system, then on the other side of the fence, if we're looking for ways to reduce, cost of operations from a regulatory standpoint, it radically reduces the need for these, very highly detailed reviews and audits that go into the current markets today. You're literally talking about the automation of audit.
Yep.
Real-time audit.
Yeah, and I think that's the other powerful thing is if you have the data and you can show immutability, then what you could have and what we do have is the ability to have point in time and click of a button audited financials, which has not been done. And so that there's massive power towards a ledger like this, and not just in a moving of tokens, but in facilitating global commerce.
That's correct. I mean, it enables comprehensive financial modeling, crazy level of modeling. Enhanced risk management. We see insurance applications galore in all of this with the automated compliance reporting. And then, of course, that all accrues to efficient capital allocation, right? You're talking about impacting costing across the board for assets, not only assets themselves and the management of the assets, but the administration, of all the back office organizations themselves.
Yeah.
So let's drill in a little bit on this rights and obligations ledger component, because this is very important. Because we can separate the rights from the assets with independent tracking of those rights and obligations. And when I talk about rights, I'm talking about right of ownership, right of possession, right of use, the same property law rights that are taught in every law school, ostensibly in every jurisdiction in the world, right? These rights, because they can be separately enumerated away from the asset, they can also be independently managed and ultimately transferred on that ledger system with the accounting, with all of the tail of the tape that goes into that. And then ultimately they can be bundled separately to unlock latent value within the asset itself, because you are talking about future states, for example. Derivatives can be created from this.
Yeah.
The other very important thing with this right now in blockchain and asset tokenization 1.0, the regulators want to see everything under a regulated custody purview. And that's because they have a single throat that they can go choke. They just assume that, well, I don't have any visibility into the nature of a token moving from wallet A to wallet B on a layer one blockchain network. So I'm going to have to rely on some other third party to actually keep their arms around that and come and report and tell us what that means. What was that token movement? Me just giving somebody something? Was that a loan? Was I moving it to a custodian? Did I sell it? Did I buy it? There's no visibility because blockchains are pretty dumb without a lot of extra Oracle metadata injection. And again, keep in mind, the oracles themselves are not standardized and they don't interoperate even between institutions, and they don't interoperate between other chains. So now you're talking about a very interesting scenario that checks the boxes, not only for the benefit of the asset owner and managers themselves by unlocking those latent values, but then accruing to back to the regulatory side. We think this solves a lot of issues that are present today because you now have visibility into the nature of a transaction, based on fundamental property law, based on fundamental property rights. You want to weigh in on that one, Brandon?
No, I'm going to keep moving, but I am going to ask this question.
Yep.
Why hasn't this been done?
Well, it's hard. I mean, when you look at the scope of the entirety of the team that's come together, we've pooled $250 million approximate in intellectual property to launch this network across all of the companies. So this is not just your typical tech startup. This is a very mature effort across a spectrum of mature companies that have been at it for a while. So to go and recreate this, good luck. It's going to take an awful lot of work if you're starting from ground zero. And the brain trusts that can come along and align in a fashion where we recognize the value of working together in a shared space where you've mutualized the benefit, even as a founding company. I can't do all this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to play with hardware when I was younger in my career and solder motherboards, but Lord have mercy, I hated it. I'm a software data guy, right? Like they call it hardware because it's hard. But we have amazingly gifted people on the team that's where their passion is. They love hardware. They get down into the nitty gritty of electrons flowing, and they're already looking at the advances of quantum and the implications of quantum proof cryptography and all of these things. So I would say that that's why it typically doesn't exist, because people start out with just a very narrow blinder based view of a core value proposition, and they see maybe what ultimately could exist as a result of the combination of all these technologies as an end state. but you just can't do it inside of a single company. I mean, it's even been hard for us with multiple companies to go and talk to other financial stakeholders, and it's so big. People look at it as like, this is like a dent in the universe. Are you guys actually going to be able to pull this off? It's
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
well, yeah, we're going to pull this off because we've already implemented each of these pieces of technology respectively in other independent areas. So it's not like a cold build; it's an integration effort on our part.
I love all that and agree. And I think I might summation it all to say this, that you've got a bunch of first principle thinkers. And so a lot of times what you see is you have a pressure of MVP and get to market and then iterate and learn, right? The problem when you do that is that you move into oftentimes solving for symptoms, not problems. If you
Yes.
don't start with the root of the problem of what really is going on, then it's you're designing on a flawed foundation already with any implementation that you do downstream from there. And one of the things that Conduit and all of the team members that you're talking about in the different organizations is that everybody starts with a first principle and primitives concept of solving for something, which means that we believe that our solutions are much more well thought out. Now they're harder. You've got to go back before you can go forward. You've got to go back and understand what needs to be done. And that, to your point, which you've said multiple times, this isn't just technology. You've got to get law, you've got to get finance, you've got to get multiple different elements of economies involved to go, what is it that we're designing for? And how do we build something that affects all of these and starts to move the velocity much faster, more efficient, and in a trusted environment?
Amen.
Cool.
What he said. So what's next? 10XDS, I'm hoping to launch probably by the end of first quarter. We're going to open up a pilot program for asset tokenization 2.0. This is going to be tightly controlled
So cool.
because we are looking for the right kinds of projects with the right stakeholders that understand that this is a collaborative effort to launch into this asset tokenization 2.0 space. So we'll be accepting 10 applicants max into this beta to work alongside and build. So if you need to get your asset tokenized today because you've got a primary issuance that's kicking off for raising money on January 15th, this probably isn't the program for you. But for the right folks, which will be, watch the 10XDS, the Conduit company pages, and the social media channels. We'll post it on the respective websites. When we open up the actual application, we'll announce it, and we'll be accepting applications from folks that wish to be considered as part of this pilot effort as we go into the the pilot builds for this coming year. So, and then, you can learn more. There's so much more. 10xts.com is the website for 10xts. cndt.io is the website for the network, for Conduit Network, which is really highly focused just on the network side of it. If you folks have been watching today, you've seen the scroll bar down at the bottom. We are having an event at the end of January in Seattle. I voted for like the Bahamas, but I got outvoted. So we're going to have an event in Seattle in the end of January, Deep End Day. This will actually be the second one that we're having. And I'll be putting together a real world asset tokenization track as part of that event heretofore. So with all of that.
And on that, Michael, for anyone who can't attend in person, we will have it live streamed as well, just like the last one. So we'd love, of course, anytime we get in real life with people, we'd love for you to come and join us in the studio for that. But if you can't, please tune in online as well.
So I know we're up against time here, but I figure I've got another 15 minutes or so to keep going. If folks have to drop off from calendar standpoint, I understand, but I did want to get to some questions, and I see in the question stream, we've had a couple of folks that are asking questions. Brandon, do you want to get into?
Yeah. So the first one was, would it be fair to say that DPIN is what Ethereum was meant to be, but truly decentralized through infrastructure? My mind thinks about DApps, but for asset tokenization management. What do you think, Michael?
Well, they were wanting to build a decentralized computer, but then they were relying on the physical infrastructure that everybody else was bringing to the table to actually implement that thesis. And, as we discussed, you go back to first principles. You've got the consolidation of compute from a hardware standpoint, centralized cloud, all of the requisite cybersecurity issues, even if it were decentralized? Are people standardizing advanced cybersecurity threat monitoring and mitigation? How do you check all the boxes here? So potentially, yes.
Well, and Ethereum was never meant or built to, let's say, replace the internet as we know it. To be clear, you would. There's a lot of things that you would never run on Ethereum for its lack of efficiencies, right? And so you might use it as a settlement layer to speak, but there's plenty of things that it is not qualified. And it's just the same notion here that there was early on, there was a lot of conversations around everything's going to be run on blockchain. It's the next evolution of the internet. That's not true. That's not feasible. Blockchain is immutable ledger. It has great purpose for very specific things, and it should be used for that, but it's not a catch-all. And it could
we didn't get into today, Brandon. We didn't even get into computable contracts and some of the other technologies that are inside the layers. We're going to have a couple more of these sessions to unpack, some of the other things that are there. But I would say just the nature of the code itself for smart contracts, it's the rigidity of that code doesn't suit well for real world business.
No.
Right? I mean, business things changes very rapidly, and you launch a smart contract, it's rigid, and all of a sudden you find the context that contract was launched in from a business case has changed. Now what?
It's also not a contract.
Well, notwithstanding the fact that it's not actually a contract, right?
But
some attorneys on the call would argue that they could make the case that it's a contract, but I have yet to see any UCC filing with source code in it. So I don't know. I'm not an attorney, but I have wonderful debates like that with my attorney friends. So, no, it's a great question.
The second part is my mind thinks about DApps, but for asset tokenization management.
Well, my comment to that is I love my blockchain folks that are blockchain focused, right? They're very innovative folks. But the idea that you're going to write a brand new decentralized app just so that it can operate in conjunction with hash values and tokens and smart contracts and these things, and you've got a brand new platform that now you're asking legacy institutions to rip and replace just so that they can get exposure to this other data. That's fantasy. They're not going to do it. I mean, they might start some pilot tests for some things, but no CIO, no CTO in the world is going to put their neck on the line to rip and replace the entirety of their existing financial legacy infrastructure. So now what? How do you create those interfaces to those legacy systems in such a way that you're extending the capabilities of those legacy market infrastructure enterprise applications to then work with data in a fashion that you're used to? And I know, Brandon, you like to say it's not Web 3. It's really what we're doing is more Web 2.5.
Yeah, it's a bridge of both worlds. And you brought up something, which is we talk about this often in the Web3 world and really any new emerging technology, which is adoption. Are you going to drive adoption? And the antithesis of adoption is friction. That's just the reality. You already have the fact that by nature, people and humans do not like change naturally. But if you add friction on top of that change, it's very, very difficult. And one of the things that we've kind of highlighted, and you have really well, throughout the whole stack, is that we still have a lot of friction. We have a lot of friction to the adoption. And where you've got people going like, is there a real advantage? Like if it's fully integrated in its full state of what you're talking about, I see the advantage. But right now today, is there an advantage? Because I see a lot of friction that's being caused if just by tokenizing. Creating a digital twin of something is very simple. Then what? Then what happens after all of that, right? All the downstream, and you're like, well, we're still living in legacy process, in legacy standards, regulations, everything else. So great, we've got this digital twin. What do I do next? Did it actually move me forward by doing that? Do I have the liquidity on the other side, which you love talking about, the liquidity fairies, right? Are they there? And so until we solve some of the fundamental underlying, issues here in terms of reducing friction to get to the endpoint, I don't know that we're going to see mainstream adoption. And that if we were to again kind of culminate what we've done here and why 10xDS is so vital to conduit as well, and vice versa. Is to start to reduce friction along that whole path and create means to increase velocity, which now makes tokenization very viable.
It does, and it's changed my perspective as well, because previously when I was in a solution provider in tokenization 1.0, and everyone's out there creating layer one tokens, and we've all got our own ideas about solutions, and like, hey, no, hire us to build your layer one token. Don't hire those guys over there. Typical market competition, right? Because of the nature of the mutualization of the upside, I'm as equally now an ambassador to bring in other tokenization solutions providers, because only in this kind of an environment do you end up with actual co-opetition. It makes sense for me to go out and bring in institutions and bring in other tokenization providers, because it only benefits me as the network grows, right? That shared upside is incredibly important, and that shared upside can be experienced by them and anybody else that participates as well.
So that brings me actually to another point that we didn't get into, Michael, which is the notion of tokenization on demand.
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit, right? I mean, you've got all this metadata that's sitting on a DLT that ultimately, you have the concept of tokenization, but it's really just recordation of the asset. And like I said before, it only needs to be a token when it actually needs to be a token. And so people may opt to say, all right, it makes sense for me for a particular business strategy or a particular transaction, maybe because this is the only network, platform that this particular institution supports. Say it is, we're only Ethereum. We don't do anything else. Great, make an Ethereum token, right? Could be somebody else over here uses Avalanche, right? There's some argument that it could be compatible because they're EVM compatible, but maybe not. I think the important thing is that tokenization today is it's still very aspirational, right? It's not the end all say all. The magic liquidity fairy, doesn't sprinkle her dust all over everything and profit, right? It's, in fact, when you go look at the tail of the tape in markets, it's probably less liquid because you've pigeonholed your asset into just a single layer one blockchain stack, arguably making it even less liquid than if you would have just left it over the counter. So I'll leave other folks to argue with argue over those merits. But in my experience after doing this for many years, I think that it's just been premature for some of these conversations. Great pilots, great experiments, great thesis. It's been a wonderful breeding ground for the innovation itself. But I'm also hopeful that, as particularly here in the United States, that it does appear that we may have an opening now from an administration standpoint, that we can start to see some of the regulatory acceptance of some of these technologies, because they are going to create efficiency and benefit. How do we get out of our own way to allow some of this to actually flourish?
Awesome. We did get another question if we want to bring that up from Shari. Yeah. So sure, decentralization is known to reduce the risk of single points of failure, but I'm curious, how much can it actually really help? Do you have any examples or data to show how effective it is at making systems more secure and resilient? Phenomenal question. I'm going to answer it with something that most people probably wouldn't expect me to answer, although I have said it before. The best example of a decentralized distributed system that is hyper secure and resilient is the US military. They have done it for over 30 years. They have done it very, very well. And much of actually our current technology even in Web3 and different cryptography, and a lot of the basis of what has come out of here has stemmed from US military beginnings. And again, hyper secure, very resilient, very efficient. Now, while the entire ecosystem you can look at as a closed, what I'm focused on is what we would think of as like at a node level, and they're very decentralized and very distributed. So yes, that is a phenomenal, and it is extremely important They are, one of the things that the U.S. military is considered to do is to, be the logistics and mobilization as one of the best in the world. And they do that in a distributed and decentralized fashion globally, right? So I actually think that one of the best use cases that we don't point to enough in Web3, but I think they're massive. They're enormous in their magnitude, size, reach, and global distribution. So that is one of the keys that I would tell you right there. And now implementing that in a private sector and more of an economy standpoint is really the key. And that's what we've been working on. But then for us right here, we have a bunch of military cybersecurity experts that are on the team, and we've taken a lot of that learning, right, going back to first principles on what made that so well, why did that work and work so well, and then looked at implementing it in a consumer free market type of environment. But the architecture is a true, very good analogy, I would say, on one-to-one. Michael, would you answer that any differently?
No, that's a great analogy. And even myself, I always forget that as, decentralization is people too. So
Yes, it is.
How it operates, governance, permissions,
That's
mandates, the authorizations to do certain things, who gets to launch nuclear missiles, who doesn't.
Who has the keys, right? Those are key. Like all of that it's fascinating. I think we would do better in Web3 to look and use that as a absolutely incredible success story at an order of magnitude that is far larger. New question: since they are meant to be global, do you see potential for the appearance of competing standards, or is it just the lack of them? Great question.
Yeah, I mean, one could argue that standards are just simply based on the level of adoption and penetration, right? But then you have other standards bodies that are out there like ISO, and they're trying to bring together big brain folks, and they get around the conference table and deliberate on what should or shouldn't be the standard and vote on it and those kinds of things. I don't have an answer to that, right? We have an approach, right? Will people adopt our approach? Hopefully, I bet the farm on it, right? But at the same time, I think that you're talking about an interoperability into other existing standards, because you're talking about a fundamental master data management strategy at the core. And so in every jurisdiction in the world, let's just take, for example, a shareholder subscription agreement, right? There's a document, there's a legal contract that gets signed in some fashion or some form under the regulation of that particular jurisdiction. That can be normalized and correlated from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, right? So you are talking about the portability of the metadata in such a way that it can be then interfaced and consumed, integrated through other layers. It doesn't lock people in per se. They're ultimately in control and own that master data management repository of their data. It's their data, right? Even as a solutions provider, I've always preached, do not lock your data up inside of a vendor-driven solution, an institution. Set your data free. You should own and control all of that data. It's yours, right? Yeah. And that's where the existing web and web companies really, the biggest money that they make is off of exploiting their user data, right? Without attribution. I don't get a percentage of the money that Mark Zuckerberg receives as a result of using my personal information on Facebook. The shareholders of Facebook get that money, right? And so there's an opportunity to really rethink some things, even all the way down to how standards are created and implemented.
I might answer it a little bit higher level, which is there's a spectrum to everything. There's a spectrum to decentralization. There's a spectrum to security. There's a spectrum to standards as well, right? And what you want to do in successful standards is create the things that we could think of as a commodity, something that should be a relevant crossover in a Venn diagram across multiple subsets that can be standardized. But you don't want to do is push standards up into places where you start to crush innovation and creativity. Right. And that's a fine line that you've got to fit in. But I think how we might answer it is that I say this and use it as the notion of the 4 pillars of the internet, and that the internet wasn't built with standards that had to do with settlement, had to do with security, had to do with identity and authority. None of those were taken into consideration. And I would say we have an opportunity now to standardize some of those things and elements of them, which create a very strong, efficient baseline and foundation for everyone to build upon, which if you can do that, then your byproduct of that is going to be much more incredible, first of all, interoperability. But the second thing is that the tenets of settlement, of security, of identity and authorization are all now inherited in what's built above, which means when they're talking to one another, you've got standards going. Now, again, you don't want to do this to where you're killing innovation and killing creativity, because otherwise brilliant minds will just go build in much more less flexible. So you want to push standards up to a point in which it makes sense until you've completed the next phase of standards have been comprised. The levels that I'm talking about, Michael, we've got 35 years, 40 years of history, right? To go like, okay, we know what didn't work. And then we had the cobbled together different opinions that were built on top that got us to where we are today. So there's some of these things that I think most people would agree we can standardize this in some form or fashion. But again, I just want to be clear, when we throw out big terms like decentralization, security, standardization, there's a spectrum to all of that. And we got to make sure that as we think about that and architect, we're taking that into consideration.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Well, at the top of the hour, brother, we want to close it out.
Yeah. So again, thank you all for joining us. Super, super fun. Michael, we got to do this again.
Yes, absolutely.
First of all, we've got plenty of other topics to get into anyways. But thank you for joining, for sharing your mind share. You are an incredible mind. And we just thank everyone for attending. Let us know if there's follow-up questions. This will be, kept as a live stream. People can go back and record, there'll be a recording, go back and view it. And then, like Michael already said, please join us for DPIN Day coming up. And we'd like to hopefully make some of these a reoccurring theme here and getting education out and talking about topics and what's happening in this ever-evolving world and how Conduit is kind of taking their twist on moving us forward. So again, Michael, thank you so much from you, your mind, your heart, everything about you, brother. We greatly appreciate you.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you, everybody who attended today.